All right, we're in the book of Ecclesiastes. And as we've talked about it several times, that Solomon will introduce his topic, I guess, that with kind of a shock, really to grab our attention. And once he's done that, then he kind of launches into more of the particulars of it. If I can find Ecclesiastes. Sorry, I'm gonna cast, Brian. If I can get it pulled up here. So he kind of gets our attention with this shocking statement that life is just emptiness. It's like grasping at wind. And having gotten our attention, then he begins to kind of, I like what Robert said a week or two ago. It's almost like a letter to himself, maybe like an open letter to the world that, hey, here's what I did, here's what I went through. And there was something here from, in fact, this chapter, I mentioned to you before, Mark Tullis, who just, Mark and Melissa just recently placed membership, but his brother Stuart preaches, and he wrote this little book. It's not like a verse-by-verse study, but it's kind of more summary in nature, but it is, it's pretty good stuff. And, he titles this chapter, where he's going to deal with chapter 3 of the book of Ecclesiastes, he calls it, "Why Should I Listen to You?" and it's almost like that's what Solomon is saying at points in the book. Well, why should you listen to me? Well, because I tried this, I tried that. Sometimes people say, well, if I just had more money, I'd be happy, there'd be meaning in my life. Well, Solomon says, I had as much money, just practically, perhaps more so than anybody ever. Didn't bring me happiness. Well, if I had more stuff, that would bring me happiness and meaning in my life. Well, Solomon could say, I had so much stuff. I could have as much as I wanted. I could get more. All the different things that people might go through. Solomon's saying, been there, done that. And that's when you get to the conclusion of the book, chapter 12, verse 13. Of course, there's a section there about 9 through 14. But particularly in verse 13, he says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole of man. And it seems that that's sort of what he's saying there, is when he says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Hey, I've been there, I've done that, and I can tell you, this is what brings meaning in life. So, that said, as you see here, we are in chapter 3, because he's going to kind of, having announced his shocking statement that all of life is vanity, then he proceeds to talk about his search. And here, as I mentioned last week, we were kind of sort of introduced this chapter, didn't really have time to get into it. It's almost like he's going to talk about some of his observations along the way. There's something I had in here that I was... But this is a very familiar section of Scripture, right? Everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. We think of seasons, at least perhaps, I don't know if we necessarily, can't speak for everybody, but I suppose when I read the word season, just the first thing that comes to my mind is spring, summer, autumn, winter. But we use that word, season or seasons, in a figurative way as well, do we not? We often talk about seasons of life. It seems that's more the idea here that he's got. Yeah, there are seasons in that literal sense, obviously, and that's kind of the thing. It seems that's sort of what Solomon is saying to us. God, through Solomon, is saying to us, is that, like one of the things that we're reminded of, in fact, after the flood, you may recall that God made a covenant with Noah. What was that covenant? Never destroy the earth by flood again. There are local floods, but we know the earth will never be destroyed by flood again. Now, God did not promise never to destroy the earth again, or period, because there is coming a day at the end of time the earth will be destroyed, and the earth and the elements and all that's therein will be burned with fire. But never to destroy the earth by flood again. But in the course of that, there in Genesis 9, he talks about as long as time stands, there'll be seed time and harvest, and we would sort of paraphrase that to say there'll be seasons. And so when you find yourself in the midst of just a blistering hot summer, and you think, "Boy, I just can't stand this heat anymore," you know what? At some point, that's going to break, and it's going to give way to autumn or fall, and at some point, that's going to give way to winter. And sometimes we find ourselves in winter, and maybe you're a cold-natured person. I always say I'd rather be burning up hot than to be cold, but some people are the exact opposite. That's sort of preference, I guess. But you might be in the middle of a very cold, bitter winter, and you're thinking, "Man, I'm so tired of being cold. I'm so tired of this cold weather." But again, we know if the Lord tarries and if we live, we'll see it'll break. It'll give way to spring. But just as surely, there are seasons of life, and one season may give way to another. And it's not to say that when you look at this text, he's not trying to say that it's always going to go just perfectly in order. It doesn't. He's saying that there are seasons in life. So I think there's also another way to look at this, and it's kind of it's sometimes it's a two-edged sword when you're looking at a bunch of different sources to study a book, and sometimes I tend to do that when if I haven't taught a book before, because I always say the first time teaching a book is the most difficult for me. That's sort of my thoughts on that. I guess other folks may disagree, but it always seems to me that's the most difficult time, the first time I've taught something. And I feel like if I ever go back and teach it again, I don't know, just the second time through is so much easier. I also find myself that second time through, or third or fourth for that matter, looking and finding myself catching all the things that I go, I don't like how I approached that. I don't like the way I did that. But so a lot of times I'm bringing in a bunch of different sources, and as I said, it's sort of a two-edged sword because sometimes you get slightly different takes, and part of me just sharing what my studies with you all, I want to share all of that, but I also worry sometimes that you could put so much out there that it kind of becomes just like white noise, I guess. But there are kind of two different approaches that I've seen with some of the folks that I looked at that they take with this chapter, seasons being seasons of life, but also some kind of approach this section as far as exposition, looking at it in terms of a time for this, a season for this, a season for that, a time for this, time for that. In terms of, hey, know how to behave, appropriate behavior in each particular time. And I say all that just to say this. This is one that I'm mentioning both of those positions because I don't really see why it has to be one or the other. I don't see it as an either or. I think it's probably a little bit of both of those. Sometimes, and I suppose there were some that I saw that kind of took that approach, but it seemed like a lot of commentators, books, even some audio I found was listening to. It's almost like they want to go with either it's dealing with seasons of life or it's talking about excuse me, how we would say sometimes, well, hey, now you need to understand there's a time for, we might say to somebody that jokes around a lot, maybe they're joking around too much, hey, look, there's a time to joke and there's a time to be serious. Or maybe somebody's having too much fun, and we say, look, there's a time to work, or there's time to have fun, but there's also a time to work. We might just as easily say to somebody that works too much, like, hey, there's a time to spend some time with your family, and there's a time to work, and so on. I don't really see when you study this that it has to be one of those or the other. I think I see both concepts here that, yeah, there is a time. We need to understand the times and the seasons in that sense. But also, there are going to be times, seasons that we go through in our lives. So that's, again, I don't always bring out like if there's two different ideas, but I think it makes sense here because I think it's a little bit of both. All right, so let's look at chapter 3, and then let's look at this list, first of all, rather, and then we'll make some observations. Left-hand side is New King James, right-hand side is ESV, as we've been doing. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, a time to pluck up, or to pluck what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to gain and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. So again, this concept of seasons, but also understanding some things are not appropriate at a certain time, whereas some things, there's a time for that. And we understand that. I think that kind of goes without saying. There was some notes I had on this from just working our way through this list, and just some quick observations. I think most of these are pretty self-explanatory. This is from the World Video Bible School class. On verse 1, there's an appointed time. When he says there's an appointed time, or to everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven. Just making the observation here that the point being made is that we don't just throw our hands up in despair and give up. Keep in mind the end of chapter 2, because that's kind of, you almost get that at the end of chapter 2, like just, what's the point of anything? But there's time, there's a purpose for everything. That's the view of some. Just throw your hands up, give up in frustration, despair. But rather, the point here is, view life optimistically, because God is in control. And that seems to be kind of the overarching theme here. Yeah, there's a season for everything, but God is in control. In Psalm 29, it's one of my favorite psalms in that entire huge book. It's the largest book in the Bible, of course, longest book in the Bible. But I've told y'all years ago when I was in preaching school, and we were picking our text for Old Testament expository preaching, and I didn't have a text, and I had a couple in mind that were, some of the usual ones that we're all probably more familiar with, and those got all taken. And so when it came my turn to pick, I was like, hold on. And Brother Mosier says, why don't you do Psalm 29? And I was like, no, just give me a minute. And he says, no, you do that. I think you'll do a good job with that. And I went and looked at Psalm 29. Don't think I'd ever even read it before. I was like, what is this? And so I studied through it, of course, and did my Old Testament expository lesson. And it's just become one of my favorite texts. It's become one of those sermons that I've preached. I think I counted, last count I had, I've preached at like 20 different congregations. I think it was over 20. But I love that text and that lesson. But at the very end of that psalm, the whole psalm really, it's a short psalm. I think it's 12 verses. But it's centering on somebody who is witnessing or has just witnessed a storm, a great, maybe like a thunderstorm, or might even be something more akin to what we would call a tornado that is sweeping or has just swept across the land. But the end of that psalm, he goes through the psalm, and you see, some people call it the psalm of the seven thunders, because you have 7 different times within the text that God's voice speaking through nature thunders. But at the end of the psalm, it says, "The Lord sitteth upon the flood, yea, the Lord sitteth king forever." And every time I've preached that, and of course I can still remember studying that for the first time, and just how exciting it was just to see this. It was just neat, because who's not familiar with a thunderstorm, right? And to picture that in the psalm and God's voice speaking through nature in that form. But at the end, that verse seems to be indicating that, even when you look at a storm, a tornado, a hurricane, nature in general, but especially in the form of a storm there in that context, and you see that power, and it seems so reckless. It certainly is powerful, but at times it seems reckless, out of control. But the psalmist says, God sits upon the flood. God sits king forever. He's in control. And we need to make sure that we realize that, and we need to make sure we stay with God. And so that seems to be kind of the idea, overarching idea here in this section. He is the one who is supreme. Now, a few other observations on some of these. Verse 2, time to be born, a time to die. This is, kind of the idea of beginning and end. Every person has a beginning and an end, at least our time on this earth. And again, these are things that in the natural course of life, now some people, for whatever reason, decide to end their own lives, but in the natural course of things, these are 2 things specifically that we have zero control over. When are you going to be born? When are you going to die? We don't know. We don't have any control over that. Again, it seems so. It could be frustrating. It could be lead us to despair if we don't realize that there is a God in heaven, the God of heaven. He's in control. So beginning and end, time to be born, a time to die. And we got to remember that what's done in between that is what really counts. You could just stop right here on that. A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to, as the New King James has it there, pluck up or pluck what is planted. But it's the idea of a time to sow and a time to reap. That's Galatians 6:7. God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. And so it's what I do in between the planting, the reaping, the birth, the death. That is what counts in our lives. Our time is not, in reality, our time. It's God's time. I've said this before. It's not original to me, but we own but one thing. One single solitary thing in all of our lives, and that's it. And if you doubt that, then just see what does a person take beyond this life? That is that one thing, which is what? It's your soul. That's it. The time I have is borrowed. The blessings I have, I'm just a steward. It all belongs to God. The earth is the Lord's, the fullness thereof. Psalms talk about this several times. But I'm just a steward. You're just a steward. We have one thing. And when we leave this life, however long or short that time between time to be born, time to die is, That's all we're going to take is our soul. And those are, well, at least you would think, will be sobering thoughts. But so often we forget about that. And we pursue things in this life. And we chase after the things of this life, the things that we don't really own at all. We're just stewards. And sometimes we sort of take that for granted. That latter part, verse 2, time to plant, time to, we might say, reap. This is the idea of being creative and destructive. You see the same thing in verse 3, time to kill, time to heal, break down, build up, and so on. Let's see, was it? Yeah, verse 4, this fella points out that these seem to have to do with emotions, time to weep, a time to laugh, time to mourn, time to dance. There's a time to be happy and rejoice, and there's a time, a season, where we're not going to be happy. I mean, sometimes it may be in the form of sickness. Well, nobody enjoys that. Nobody's going to rejoice and celebrate when they're stuck at home in bed with the flu. Or it could be something, some kind of ongoing thing. Could be something like a cancer diagnosis. Nobody rejoices about that. That's not a season for rejoicing. Maybe loss in the form of a broken relationship, maybe loss in the form of death. Nobody rejoices about that. But there is a time that we rejoice, and don't lose your life worrying about you could, and again you can see where Solomon. Sometimes if you're reading this, I don't know. Sometimes I just feel almost like I'm going through this struggle with Solomon, because you can sort of see it, time for this, time for that, time for this, time for that, and you can see where, okay, all right, so there's a season for everything, and things are going. I'm pretty blessed right now. Things are going well. Oh well, you know what that means. It's just a matter of time. Just a matter of time, and things are really going to go south. And man, I wonder if it's today. And I may get through today, and it's not a bad day. And I go to bed, and I think, well, avoided it one more day. I wonder if tomorrow's the day the other foot's going to drop. Man, I just better brace myself for that. And I wake up that morning, and I got to be prepared, because this could be the day. Because, it's just like the Bible says, there's time for everything. I mean, can you imagine? Isn't that a miserable way to go through your life? Some people do, though, don't they? But you could also go through life so sort of carefree, happy-go-lucky, foolish, really, be a better way to put it, that you just kind of, I'm just going to act like nothing bad's ever going to happen. You just sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Almost blind optimism, but I don't think that's the phrase I'm looking for. But just this foolishness where there's not, in fact, in this very book, Ecclesiastes 7, verse, I think it's 2, he's going to say, it's better. He starts off in verse 1, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. So it's this idea, Pollyanna, Jacob says, yes, thank you. Kind of a Pollyanna, carefree, you just don't have that seriousness about anything, but that's what the wise man is saying in chapter 7, verse 2. It's better to go to the house of mourning than the house of feasting. He's not saying, man, I really love a good funeral. He's saying that's the end of all the earth. That's the way of all the earth. Sometimes, at least twice in Scripture, the Bible uses that terminology. Once David speaking to Solomon, once Joshua speaking to the nation of Israel. Well, that's the way of all the earth, death. So I don't want to go around thinking about it all the time. Well, what the The Bible says it's appointed unto men once to die. What if today's the day for me? And I can't even enjoy my life. But you don't want to go around with that just that kind of a Pollyanna type attitude where I just never take anything serious. So, man, there's some profound thoughts here. You know, that's what, I don't know if I've ever just sat down and studied this section as I did getting ready for class, because you just sort of, and in some ways you look at it, it is what it is. It says what it says, but some pretty profound stuff here as well. So a time to weep, time to laugh. You know, again, the emotions there, verse 4. And you know, we would even say from verse 4 was one of those things where you don't sit there and try to, at a funeral, make it some kind of just happy-go-lucky event. But you don't want to try to turn something that is meant to be enjoyable and fun into just drag it down to a depressing state either. So, you know, again, time for everything. Verse 5 is something that, this is another one of those where people are kind of, scholars are sort of divided. A time to cast away stones, time to gather stones. It may be that, I was looking, where was here it is. It says, this fellow here says, this line has puzzled scholars. There are two main interpretations. Casting away stones might be a reference to clearing rocks off your land so you could plant, particularly a field. Have you ever done that? Especially if maybe you decide you're going to have a new garden spot. And I'm telling you, like, if there's one thing that's plentiful in the Middle Eastern region, and especially the Palestinian region, it's rock. I mean, it's just, there was, what was his name? Vern, at the Biblical History Center. He used to tell this joke. It was a joke, obviously, but he would tell this little humorous anecdote about that there was, I think he said maybe among the Jews or peoples in that Middle Eastern region, that God sent out, I think it was some kind of a bird with this just sack, this ginormous bird with this sack filled with rocks. And these were the rocks to cover all the earth. These were to disperse all over the earth. And the legend was that when he got over Palestine, he sort of stumbled or something, and just the entire sack just fell, and all the rocks that were meant for all the world fell on Palestine. But there are a lot of rocks in that region. But my point is, even here in our country, we probably don't have nearly the rock, but if you've ever tried to start up a new garden spot in a new place, you probably came across some larger rocks that you had to dig out. Maybe sometimes even with a tiller, if you got one of those like hand tillers, it may just hit it and you can't get it. So now you got to dig around and find like, just how big is this rock? Get it out. It's a process, and so that may be what's being referred to here in verse 5. He's clearing off rocks so he could plant, but eventually realizes they're just too many, and so he throws the stones he's collected back into the field. And the time to gather would be when a sufficient number of rocks can be cleared in order to use the land for building or for planting or whatever. That's one idea. The other idea that scholars think is pretty much one of the two. But the other possibility is that it refers to like severing a relationship with someone. And it's demonstrated by a symbolic act of casting rocks. Because in a military sense, they sometimes would, in fact, you see examples of this. Man, I had this written down somewhere. So yeah, I'll tell you what, sometimes you look at so much stuff, and I guess I wrote it down somewhere else, but I'm not even going to try to find it because I'll never find it. But there are a couple of examples in, I think it's in 2 Kings, where they would put stones, having conquered someone, put a bunch of stones out there, and it was just kind of we might say sort of adding insult to injury, because you've really made things difficult for them now, especially you go put a bunch of, especially if it's huge, large stones in somebody's field, now you've really handicapped their ability to sow and thus to reap. So it may be something referencing that. It kind of came to be one of these where if a relationship severed, there's that casting of stones, and gathering stones would refer to, sometimes would refer to work being done to prepare the way for a military leader. I don't know. I'm not sure that one is the most likely to me, at least. But be that as may, those are kind of two options there. That's one of those verses that sometimes just ancient Hebrew is difficult to figure it out. If you got I think the New King James does it. I know the ESV does. There'll be footnotes sometimes, and there's a handful of them in there where it'll just simply say in the footnote, the Hebrew here is very difficult. And sometimes, I remember the first time reading through, using the ESV for my daily Bible reading, and I was kind of like, well, thank you for that scholarly insight. But sometimes that's the best you can do, because it's just very difficult. And what they're saying is, the way we've translated is the way we think is the best, but it's admittedly a very difficult verse or section. None of these are, obviously anything that have to do with doctrine or anything like that, but just sometimes there's some difficult Hebrew for that ancient Hebrew. That seems to be the case there in verse 5. Verse 6, this has to do with possessions, time to gain, time to lose, time to keep, time to throw away. Well, some of us have a harder time with time to keep. Some of us have a harder time with time to throw away, right? There's a time for everything, though, right? And you might be a hoarder that needs to learn, hey, sometimes there's a time to throw away. But you might be a minimalist that needs to learn that, hey, sometimes there's a time to keep. I still laugh with a lot of the Bremen folks. I laugh with the Hightower folks about, I don't know, I was trying to think when that was. I think it was 2021 when it was Dale Hickey's funeral. And it was one of the coldest days we'd had around here in years. I mean, it was just, we get what we say is cold, but people, I guess, from more northern regions and such say that it really didn't get that cold here. But anyway, it was one of those, like, I think the feels like was in the 20s, if it might have even been down in the teens. And so I'm getting ready to go. I'm supposed to speak for this. It was just a graveside only, and just a handful of family there. And so Sue Gross had told me, she asked me if I would just do a little short graveside. She said John would do it, but she said, I just want John to be there with me and kind of be there more as a family support. I said, absolutely love to. Well, I'm getting ready. They're going to meet me here and pick me up, and I'm going to ride over there with them. And I can't find this. I had kind of I guess it'd be like a trench coat type thing. I said, Reagan, where's that coat my mom gave me? She said, oh, I got rid of that. You did what? I got rid of that. I got rid of that years ago. Well, why would you do that? She said, Chad, we live in Georgia. Doesn't even get that cold here. I said, it is today. She said, oh, just put your other coat on. I said, that's not like a dressy coat. You can't wear that over a suit. She said, oh, I don't really think it'll matter. I said, I do. I'm not going to do that. So I go, and of course, John and Sue pull up. I'm getting in the car, and first thing, Chad, where is your coat? It is freezing. She said, let me just tell you where my coat is. Somebody probably is wearing it. It could be there at the funeral today, because it's been taken like to a thrift store or something. I don't know. It's a good question. Where is my coat? So I get there. We get to the gravesite, and so I get out of the car, and I see Sister Tammy or Sister Connie or somebody from the church. Chad, where is your coat? It is cold. Yes, ma'am, it is. It's really cold. I don't know where my coat is because it's gone. It's just, we live in Georgia. So here comes Jacqueline Hightower. Mackenzie now. And she says, Chad, it is so cold. Where on earth is your coat? I said, well, so we had a good time with it. We laughed about it. Jacqueline and Kyle were there. Mr. Bill had taken a day off, she said, for the first time, and she said it was been several years. So what I didn't know until later was Mr. Hightower was telling me that that's Jacqueline's first time. She had just recently graduated mortuary school, and it was her first time directing a funeral. Now, she'd done hundreds of funerals, but that was the first time directing. And she was very nervous about that. And so I found out later from Mr. Bill, he said, oh, she got such a kick out of that. And that just kind of helped set her at ease. And I said, well, I never would have guessed that was her first time directing, or she was nervous. But anyway, so we went on. We kind of laughed about it. I got through it. I shivered my way through. And the next week, I got a call from Mr. Bill, and he says, hey, Chad, can you come by the office? And it's not real urgent, but just when you get a chance. So I was kind of like, that's strange. So I didn't know. I'm like, did I do something wrong? What's going on? So I said, sure. So I swung by there one day. Well, he calls me in there and takes me in one of the little viewing rooms, and they had two coats in there. These big wool, nice coats like the Hightower folks wear. And he said, this is from Jacqueline and Kyle. They wanted to give you a coat. So the next time you have to do a graveside when it's really, really cold, you'll have a coat. And he wanted me to stop by because wanted me to try it on because, you wear those over a suit, and so you got to make sure you get the size right. But, and to this day, when I see Miss Jacqueline, the first thing she'll say is, you still got that coat? I say, yes, ma'am, I do. She'll say, is it still hanging in your office? Yes, ma'am, it is. Because I told him, I said, now, this is not going home. Because next time, and I don't know that I've had an outside situation yet where it was really, really cold and I needed to wear that, but I got it. I got it when it happens. Because you know what? I live in Georgia, but sometimes, even in Georgia, it gets cold, really cold. And so, time to keep, time to throw away. I always think about that. I think probably from the rest of my life when I read that verse, that's probably going to be what I think about. All right, so a time to tear, a time to sow. He kind of goes on here. Human relations is the idea. Some people see in this the tearing apart, sewing together, being kind of mourning, ceasing the period of mourning, mending. Because, a lot of times in the Jewish culture, they would tear their clothes. But there was great shock, mourning. Maybe. I don't know. That's another one of those where I could see that going either way. Some people think that. Other people think it refers to relationships where there's a time that the relationship needs to be severed, tearing apart. Other times when a relationship is worth mending, sewing together. To me, that maybe makes the most sense, perhaps, at least for my studies thus far. But there is a time that we need to sever relationships, right? Because I remember when I was not faithful as a Christian, and started getting more serious about spirituality, and thinking like, okay, I need to. There were some relationships that just didn't really work anymore, and I tried at first to maybe see if I couldn't be salt and light, as Jesus uses those terms, Matthew 5:13 through 16. But it was obvious pretty early on. Didn't take long that they just weren't having it. And so I was smart enough, even I was still pretty young and naive and foolish sometimes and immature at times. But even then, I was smart enough to realize, okay, if I'm going to be serious about this, that they're clearly not willing to change, consider any different course. So I'm likely going to either get pulled back into that nonsense, or I got to get serious, and it's going to mean we've got to sever this relationship. Not that we became enemies or anything. We still, we see each other and we'll be friendly. It was not near the friendship that it was before. And then there are times, of course, when there are relationships that we need to mend, to sow, to cultivate, but also maybe there's been a relationship that's been severed where there's something I can do to help mend those fences, as an expression that we sometimes use. Then he goes on, time to keep silence, time to speak. Those are pretty self-explanatory. Time to love and a time to hate. By the way, a time to keep silence and a time to speak is, as this fellow says, the biggest problem. Man has always had a problem with the tongue. We've talked about that recently. James 3 deals with that. There's not a person, again, going back to kind of what paraphrasing James, not a person that could say, you know what, I don't ever have to worry about that. I always know when to speak. I always know when to keep silent. Well, we might be able to say that as far as I always know when to speak and when to keep silent. But nobody can say I always do so. And that's James' point. But there is a time to speak, time to keep silence, time to love, time to hate. This is, as this fellow says, it covers the whole spectrum of tearing down and building up. When is the time to hate, he asks. Well, the Bible teaches us to hate evil. God hates putting away, Malachi 2:16, hating evil, Romans 12:9, Amos 5:15, and several other verses. We're to hate a host of things related to the world. Lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, the pride of life, 1 John 2:15 through 17. But equally, there are times to strive for peace and other times to go to war. There were times when God called upon Israel to go and fight literal battles. Now, that's not going to be the case for us today, but there were times when God told Israel to do that. There were times when they were his instrument of judgment upon heathen, idolatrous people. There were times when heathen, idolatrous people were God's instrument of judgment upon Israel, such as the nation of Assyria conquering the northern kingdom, Babylon conquering the southern kingdom. But today, there's a time to go to war against evil things. The weapons of our warfare, they're not carnal, 2 Corinthians chapter 10. I'm just out of time. That gets us right to the end of those 8 verses, the season, time for everything, season for every purpose under heaven. So what we'll do is we'll maybe have just a few overarching thoughts about those verses, summary thoughts rather, and then we'll move into verses 9 and following. But this chapter is, there's a lot of really good, deep study to be had right here just in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Thank y'all so much. We'll have a short break before worship this morning.